cheating, or this game is rigged. Fine. Dear Tim and Moby, who was Fannie Lou Hamer? From Megan. Well, on August 22nd, 1964, a lot of Americans were asking that same question. That night, they turned on the TV to see Hamer on every news program. She looked like a nice, middle-aged lady, somebody's mom, or your neighbor. But in her home state of Mississippi, she was well known as a fierce voting rights advocate. For the past 2 years, she'd been fighting to get African Americans access to the polls. The Constitution said that the right to vote couldn't be denied due to race. But southern states had found all sorts of ways to get around the law. Stripped of their right to vote, black Southerners had no voice in a racist system. Try to fight it, and you face jail time, intimidation, and violence. Hamer had experienced it all, and that night she shared her story. It was just a few minutes long, but full of hardship and brutality. Viewers who'd never heard of her before wept. Overnight, she went from being a local activist to a national civil rights leader. Hamer was born in Mississippi in 1917, the youngest of 20 children. Her grandmother had been enslaved, and her parents, like many descendants of enslaved people, were sharecroppers. A plantation owner rented them farmland in exchange for a share of their crops. But he also charged high rates for tools and other expenses. So, like most sharecroppers, they were constantly in debt. Fannie Lou had to leave school after 6th grade to help her family in the fields. As an adult, she earned a position of responsibility on a plantation. She recorded each farmer's harvest and tried to get them their fair share. Then, in August 1962, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, visited her church. All around the country, the civil rights movement was heating up, and SNCC was one of the major players. Its student activists trained local community leaders to join the fight. In Mississippi, they focused on registering black voters. They told the congregation they could sweep out racist officials. Hamer was stunned. She didn't even know she had the right to vote. When SNCC asked for volunteers to register to vote, she raised her hand high. No, it wasn't that simple. An angry crowd gathered at the courthouse to meet the 18 volunteers. They tried to scare Hamer and the others from even trying to register. But the volunteers stuck together and made their way in. Inside the courthouse, the clerk was no more welcoming. He demanded the group pass a test before registering. They were asked to explain a legal clause about ex facto laws. Yeah, that was the whole point of literacy tests. To be nearly impossible to pass, so clerks could refuse anyone the right to vote. They could also demand a poll tax, a fee meant to discourage would-be voters. No surprise, all the SNCC volunteers failed the literacy test. On the way home, their bus was stopped by the police. They said its yellow color was illegal. Hamer sang to keep the group's spirits up until they were let go. That night, she was fired from her job and evicted from her home. The plantation owner had heard about her attempt to register. A few nights later, someone shot at the house where she was staying. Afraid for her children, Hamer considered leaving town for good. But she couldn't convince herself to leave the place her parents helped build. She rented a house from a neighbor and took a job with SNCC. Hamer's home became a gathering place for volunteers and civil rights leaders. Among them, she stood out. She wasn't male, young, well-educated, or middle class. She knew what poor black families endured because she'd lived it. That first-hand experience made her a powerful speaker. She would often break into song to motivate crowds. Before long, she was as well known for her singing voice as her activism. But her growing influence made her a target for racist attacks. She got threatening letters and phone calls, and her husband lost job after job. Someone even threw a bomb at her house, though luckily it failed to explode. Then, in June 1963, Hamer and 6 fellow activists were arrested. They'd tried to eat at a whites-only diner. Local police held them for 3 days, beating and torturing them. Hamer's kidneys were permanently damaged, and she lost sight in one eye. Hamer and other activists realized that local authorities weren't going to change unless they were forced to. So in 1964, they started a massive voter registration drive called Freedom Summer. It brought hundreds of mostly white college students down to Mississippi. They went door to door, registering black voters. It was dangerous work. 3 volunteers were murdered in the first week. The nation could no longer ignore what was happening in Mississippi. For the rest of the summer, stories of beatings and shootings made headlines around the country. Then, at the end of August, Hamer and other activists went to Atlantic City, New Jersey. That was the site of the Democratic National Convention, the big event where the party chooses its nominee for president. Each state sends a group of people to cast the official vote. And, no surprise, Mississippi's representatives were all white. Hamer's group was there to challenge their authority. Since the state excluded black voters, they said, the delegation was illegal. They were Mississippi's true representatives, and they had the voter registrations to prove it. Their protest caused an uproar, and Hamer was given a slot to speak. Before a national audience, she described what she had endured simply for trying to vote, being threatened and shot at by fellow citizens, being beaten by the police. She challenged the nation to consider its own values.
Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
Her testimony replayed on the news for days. Hamer and her group weren't seated at the convention. But a year later, President Lyndon Johnson would sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It outlawed all kinds of barriers to voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes. And at the convention in 1968, Hamer was chosen to be an official delegate. She received a standing ovation. Hamer's activism continued way past her primetime moment. She fought for women's rights, protested the Vietnam War, and ran for office several times. She founded Freedom Farm, a cooperative to help black farmers climb out of poverty. When she died in 1977, she was buried there. Yeah, I guess it is your turn to roll.